WBUR Podcast, Boston.
I'm Darryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Chris Erchull, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Darryl?
I'm doing pretty good. So glad to have you on the show. You are an attorney with LGBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, also known as GLAD, right?
That's correct.
Well, Chris, let's get into it. We normally cover news happening here in the Boston region, but today we're looking north because New Hampshire lawmakers are currently considering a number of bills targeting LGBTQ youth, particularly trans youth. So, Chris, to get us started, can you give us a rundown of what's being considered?
Yeah. First, I think it's helpful to look at the fact that this is not something that's unique to New Hampshire at all.
Mm-hmm.
There are state legislatures all over the country that are considering bills that would roll back the rights of transgender people everywhere. In New Hampshire, there's a number of bills that have been introduced this year that are directed at taking away rights from transgender youth. One bill is a public school bathroom bill. And that bill is written in a way that says that all multi-user bathrooms in New Hampshire have to be designated for one sex. Most public school restrooms are already designated male or female. And then, of course, schools make accommodations for transgender and gender nonconforming students who don't belong in the restroom that's typically associated with their assigned sex. And so in this case, the bill's aim is to exclude transgender students from those bathrooms. Then another bill is one that's referred to as a bill relative to the definition of child abuse. And what that bill does is it expands the definition of child abuse to include gender-affirming healthcare and providing that healthcare to minors in New Hampshire. And so that bill would essentially make any parent who provides medically necessary healthcare to their transgender children into child abusers in the eyes of the state. And then a pair of bills, one in the House and one in the Senate, HB 10 and SB 272. And those two bills are parental rights bills. And each of them has provisions that would single out gender identity as a special characteristic where schools have to report information back to parents about how students are expressing themselves in school. And then finally, of all these bills, the one that was the most extreme and the one that went the furthest was House Bill 619. One element of that bill would have prohibited all transition-related health care for all minors across the state. Another element of that bill would have repealed the ban on conversion therapy that was signed into law in 2018 in New Hampshire. And then the third element of that bill would have precluded any student from identifying consistent with their gender identity, for any transgender student to identify consistent with their gender identity in any New Hampshire public school. And that includes, using bathrooms or playing sports, but it also includes the name and pronouns you use in the classroom. And so that bill was written in a way that was just went so far beyond any other piece of legislation I've seen in any state in terms of trying to attack every aspect of a transgender young person's development.
So, yeah, Chris, I want to jump in real quick. You know, you're throwing a lot at me right now. And the one question I'm thinking is, why is this happening now in New Hampshire?
I think that at the core of what's going on across the country is a political ideology that's taken hold among a very small minority of people, but a vocal minority of people who have found that transgender youth are a really attractive political wedge. It's a very vulnerable group. It's a group that is not really well known to most people. And it's a group that doesn't have a lot of political power with which to defend themselves. Transgender children can't vote to protect their own interests, and they don't have lobbying groups. And cynical people in politics have found that leveraging the vulnerability of trans youth generates a lot of fear and a lot of anger, and it creates like a political firestorm, which is, beneficial to some people's political machinations.
Chris, we're here in Boston, and we figured some folks might find it surprising that laws like this are being considered in our region. I'm curious to know, do you find it surprising?
I'll just say I don't find it that surprising. I do find it very distressing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the idea that a lot of people have that some states are more secure than others, it's true that you're not going to see the same kind of legislation introduced in Massachusetts, and certainly it won't have the same likelihood of success if it were to be introduced. But we're still seeing a lot of contention that's being driven up in school communities, for example, even in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you're seeing school committees that are being asked by a minority number of parents to remove books by LGBTQ authors or about LGBTQ characters from school libraries, right? But then in addition to that, we're also seeing pushback or blowback in courts. And there's a really good example of a case like that in Massachusetts. In Ludlow, Massachusetts, this lawsuit was brought against the school district, and it was brought in federal court in Springfield. And the lawsuit was dismissed by the judge who heard the case. And now it's going up to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, which is going to, hear this case and issue a decision about whether or not schools have an affirmative obligation basically to circumvent what students want in terms of their expression of gender at school and notify and report to and defer to parents about what they want for their children when their children are at school, against all of the evidence about what creates the best learning environment for students, etc.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more from Chris.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back. What are you hearing from families of trans children and trans children themselves about these type of bills?
Yeah, so transgender young people are understandably in a state of fear and concern about what's going to happen in the future, right? I think that it's really important when we're talking about this perspective to keep in mind the idea that, say, a 16-year-old transgender kid who is in high school right now, they didn't grow up in the same world that some of us older folks did, where transgender people didn't have a lot of rights and weren't highly visible. They grew up in a different world where transgender people were visible and were protected by our state governments against discrimination. And that was the increasing trend that these young people saw as they were coming of age. And so to see that suddenly reverse course, it's just incredibly scary for these young people. And it's scary for their parents, too. I want to say that in the work that I do, I'm often reaching out to families affected by harmful legislation and asking them to come and talk in front of legislatures and tell their stories and express their fears and concerns. But that's a really, really taxing thing to be asking of these young people and their families to do, right? It takes a lot out of them, and it compounds the distress. But there's actually no other way to do it, right? I mean, if legislators are sitting there, there's considering bills that are going to impact the lives of transgender young people, they need to be hearing from those people.
Yeah. With that said, though, is it likely that we will see any of these bills become law in New Hampshire?
I'd like to say that it's unlikely. I do believe that there's some likelihood that some of the legislation will become law. Fortunately, the House Bill 619 that I described that had all the different component parts, including healthcare, conversion therapy, and denial of transgender people's existence at schools. That bill has been retained by the committee that was hearing it in the House, and that doesn't kill it forever. The bill's going to come back probably later this year. I think that the one that's most concerning to me today, as we sit here having this conversation, is the parental rights bill that singles out transgender students for a different level of surveillance and monitoring and reporting while they're at school. That's the bill that seems to have the most support from people in positions of power in New Hampshire.
Okay. You mentioned one of the bills got retained. It was a bill from State Representative Terry Roy. Actually, he's the primary sponsor of this bill. I want to play some tape from him from last week.
If it turns out that this gender-affirming care is the best thing for our children, then prove it, and then it will be so. But if it can't be proven, then we need to put a pause on it before we do damage to our children that we cannot repair.
Okay, Chris, the information about the benefits of gender-affirming care is out there, and it's very accessible. How much more discussion about this needs to be had?
Yeah, this is a really common thing we're hearing a lot today, and it's a little puzzling, honestly, when every single major medical association in the United States has agreed that the accepted standards of care for transgender people includes gender transition. Those medications and treatments are widely accepted as the way to treat gender dysphoria in minors. And of course, research is ongoing about what the best treatments are for minors. And of course, they'll continue to develop. That's true with any area of medicine. But the accepted standards of care are very clear now. And there's no question that with all of the evidence that we have, this is what is medically necessary for young people who are experiencing gender dysphoria.
Chris, what's at stake for families with transgender children here?
When we're talking about medically necessary health care for minors, we're talking about health care that can be life-saving, that's critically important. And if you can put yourself in the position of a parent, if you can just imagine for a second what it's like to be a parent who's being told that you have a limited number of choices. One is to comply with the law and deny your child access to medically necessary health care, even though your doctors and every expert are telling you that this is what your child needs. That's one option. Another option is to violate the law. Perhaps go out of state and find healthcare, across state lines if you have the means to do that. Another option is to move. But none of these options are actually tenable for any parent, right? And so the amount of distress that puts on a family is just overwhelming, right? Let alone the problem that arises when you have gender dysphoria that goes untreated.
How likely is it that legislation targeting LGBTQ youth will continue to be proposed in our region?
I think it's going to continue to proliferate. I don't think we've seen the end of this wave of anti-trans legislation in the country or here in New England. I think it's going to continue. I think we need to stay vigilant. I think that we need to be fighting in courts and fighting in legislatures. I also think we need to be talking to our neighbors and friends and making sure that people hear the stories of transgender young people, hear the stories of their families, and learn that all they're looking for is to be left alone, be given the same opportunities that every other young person has. This isn't a controversial issue at all. We should all want success for everybody, including transgender youth.
Well, with that said, Chris, thank you so very much for taking the time to talk with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Daryl. It was a pleasure talking to you.
That's GLAAD attorney Chris Erchull. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you have any thoughts on today's show, hit us up on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at WBUR-The-Common. You can also send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.